For more than 60 years, Cliff Richard stayed silent about the one man who changed everything for him, Paul McCartney. They were never enemies. Yet what happened between Britain's first pop idol and the boy who stole his crown has haunted Cliff ever since. He was already a star when the Beatles burst onto the scene. Then suddenly, overnight, the cheers shifted. The headlines changed. The nation had a new favorite son, and Cliff, for the first time, felt forgotten. But there's something he's never admitted until now. Because behind the smiles and polite compliments, Cliff carried a truth about Paul that he couldn't say while the Beatles ruled the world. A truth that reveals not rivalry but something far more personal and deeply human. At 84, he sets finally breaking his silence. And when you hear what he really thought of Paul McCartney, and what Paul once said about him behind the scenes, you still understand why Cliff says he sets finally at peace. In the late 1950s, Cliff Richard wasn't just another singer, he was Britain's first real rock star. The moment he stepped on stage in his black suit and narrow tie, with that confident grin and slick-back hair, the country's teenagers finally had a star they could call their own. His songs like Move It and Living Doll lit up jukeboxes from London to Liverpool. He wasn't copying America anymore, he was the sound of Britain growing up. For a few golden years, Cliff ruled everything. Every record went to #1, every concert was chaos, every smile became a poster. Even the press called him our Elvis. He performed for royalty, filled stadiums, and turned polite English pop into something that made parents nervous. Cliff was clean, charming, and safe, but he had rhythm, and that was enough to start a movement. Then came 1963. The energy shifted. The Beatles, raw, witty, and new, exploded onto the scene. Almost overnight, teenage girls who'd once waited outside Cliff's dressing room were screaming for Paul McCartney instead. The magazines that used to hang on his every word suddenly filled their covers with the four faces from Liverpool. Cliff stayed polite in public. He congratulated them on their success, smiled through interviews, and even called them good lads. But behind the calm exterior, he could feel the world changing. He wasn't angry, just confused. He'd worked so hard to build a dream, only to watch it swept away by four boys who admitted they'd grown up listening to him. It was a strange twist to inspire your own competition. Cliff had opened the doors that allowed the Beatles to walk through. Yet once they did, the crowd no longer looked back. He knew the music scene would never return to the way it was. The simple love songs, the innocence, all of it belonged to another time. For the first time in his career, Cliff Richard felt what every pioneer eventually does, the sting of being replaced by the world you helped create. Still, he didn't lash out or disappear. He reinvented. He leaned on discipline, faith, and grace, qualities that would later define him far more than fame ever did. And though he rarely spoke about it, those early years left a mark. The cheers faded. But the memory of that silence, the moment when even his most loyal fans turned the page, never really left him. Yet even as he watched the Beatles conquer the world, Cliff couldn't bring himself to resent them. Not Paul, not any of them. Deep down, he knew the truth. The crown had simply passed. What he didn't know then was that his own story with Paul McCartney was far from over, and that one quiet conversation years later would change everything he believed about their so-called rivalry. It happened quietly, away from flashing lights. Cliff and Paul met for the first time backstage at a BBC event in the mid-60s. Cliff remembered the energy, the crowd chanting for the Beatles in the next studio while he waited for his turn to perform. Paul walked in, all charm and mischief, with that effortless confidence that only youth can carry. He greeted Cliff like an old friend, not a rival. For a brief moment, the past and future of British music shook hands. Cliff congratulated him on the band's success. Paul thanked him for starting it all. It was genuine. The Beatles had grown up watching Cliff on Oh Boy and copying his stage moves. Yet even that compliment stung a little. Cliff realized he had become a memory in someone else's rise. Still, he smiled, determined not to let pride ruin the moment. Over the years, their paths crossed at award shows, charity events, and royal performances. Each time, Paul seemed relaxed, playful, while Cliff carried the calm of a man who'd learned restraint. Their conversations were short, polite, but always layered with unspoken awareness. Two men who understood fame's cost better than anyone else in the room. Cliff once recalled how effortless Paul made everything look. The jokes, the melodies, the way a crowd leaned toward him. Cliff's success had been built on precision, on polish and discipline. Paul's came from raw instinct. Watching him was both admiration and ache. Cliff saw in Paul the freedom he never allowed himself, the rebellion he'd been too careful to risk. Still, there was no hostility. Paul often praised Cliff publicly, calling him a trailblazer who gave us our start. Cliff returned the kindness, calling Paul one of the few who never lost himself. The public saw harmony, but there was tension underneath, born not of envy, but of recognition. By the late 60s, both men had changed. Cliff was turning toward faith and structure, while Paul was chasing art and experimentation. Yet every time they met, Cliff felt the same flicker of emotion, the reminder of that first handshake, when the music world had already decided who the new king was. He wouldn't talk about it openly for decades. To him, silence was safer. But the truth he finally shared later in life began right there, in that BBC hallway, the moment he realized that the young man who'd replaced him wasn't an enemy at all but a mirror. And it would take Cliff years to understand what that reflection really meant. By the early 1970s, Cliff Richard was living a very different kind of life. While Paul McCartney was touring stadiums and redefining pop with wings, Cliff was turning inward. Fame had given him everything. A mansion, adoration, success, but not peace. He began questioning the noise that came with it. Somewhere between the applause and the loneliness, faith entered the picture. Cliff's decision to embrace Christianity surprised his fans. The glamorous idol who once sang about teenage love was now speaking about grace and purpose. He withdrew from the nightlife, stopped chasing hits, and began recording gospel-inspired albums. Critics thought it was career suicide. But Cliff wasn't chasing charts anymore, he was chasing meaning. Paul, on the other hand, remained a creative force. His music evolved, experimental and unpredictable. He married Linda, built a family, and continued to live life in the spotlight. Their paths rarely crossed now, yet they were still linked in the public's memory, the perfect pair of opposites, one finding God, the other seeking freedom. Cliff once admitted he couldn't live the way most rock stars did. He needed order, routine, and faith to feel grounded. Paul thrived in chaos, creating melodies from the mess. They were two sides of the same generation, men trying to survive fame without losing themselves. But while Paul had the world's attention, Cliff was learning the value of quiet. He discovered that success wasn't about staying at the top, it was about staying whole. His faith gave him strength, but it also made him feel distant from the industry he once ruled. He saw how fame had trapped so many of his peers, the addictions, the scandals, the constant pressure to reinvent. Cliff didn't want that ending. He wanted peace before it was too late. And yet, in the stillness of his new life, he couldn't quite escape Paul's shadow. Radio stations kept playing Beatles classics. Documentaries hailed Paul as a musical genius. The same magazines that once called Cliff Britain's Elvis now called him a reminder of the pre-Beatle era. It hurt, though he rarely admitted it. He told friends that faith had cured him of jealousy. But sometimes the old feelings returned. Watching Paul's effortless brilliance reignite the world's love for the Beatles stirred something deep, admiration mixed with regret. Cliff didn't resent Paul's success, he respected it. But he wondered if, in his pursuit of goodness, he had lost the daring edge that once made him great. Faith had saved him, yes, but it had also separated him from the only world he'd ever known. Still, Cliff's story wasn't ending in isolation. Time would soften the distance between him and Paul, bringing them together again in a way no one expected. Because decades later, one conversation would finally let Cliff say what he'd been holding inside since those early years. By the mid-80s, the noise that once surrounded the Beatles had quieted. John Lennon was gone, George Harrison had stepped back, and Paul McCartney was carrying a legacy heavier than anyone could see. Cliff Richard watched from a distance, not as a rival anymore, but as a man who understood what it meant to outlive an era. He had survived the cycle of fame that crushed so many of his peers. The headlines no longer called him a teen idol, they called him a survivor. Cliff's music had matured, blending gospel calm with pop precision, and his audiences aged with him. Yet whenever Paul released something new, the press still compared them. It wasn't cruelty, it was nostalgia. Britain's first star and the one who replaced him, still linked after 3 decades. Then, at a private charity concert, they found themselves on the same bill again. Paul was reflective that night, subdued, almost weary. Cliff remembered seeing in his eyes something familiar, the look of a man who had spent too many years being everyone's memory. When they greeted each other backstage, there was no ego left, only warmth. Paul clasped Cliff's hand and said quietly, "You started all this, you know." It was more than flattery. It was acknowledgement. For Cliff, those words closed a chapter he'd been carrying since 1963. He'd never needed a trophy or chart position, just that moment of truth from the man the world had chosen after him. In the years that followed, both men leaned toward reflection. Paul wrote songs about loss and aging. Cliff embraced nostalgia, re-recording hits that once defined innocence. They were no longer competing for fans. They were defending memories. The music industry around them had become younger, faster and crueler, but together they represented something purer, a generation that believed melody could still move a soul. When Cliff spoke about Paul in interviews, his tone changed. There was no hint of jealousy now, only gratitude. He called Paul a craftsman and a friend in spirit. He even began performing Beatles songs during his live shows, not as imitation but as tribute. For fans who remembered the 60s, those moments felt like history coming full circle. Still, the admiration carried weight. Cliff often said that Paul's endurance reminded him what faith looked like in another form, not religion, but devotion to the art itself. It made Cliff see that their paths had never been opposites at all, only different ways of staying true. Decades after that quiet meeting, Cliff would finally tell the world what that handshake meant to him and what Paul's simple words had unlocked. The rivalry the press had invented was gone. What remained was something deeper, understanding. When Cliff Richard finally decided to speak openly about Paul McCartney, it wasn't in a grand interview or documentary. It happened softly, during a conversation about gratitude. He'd been asked which artists he admired most. He paused, smiled, and said, "Paul, because he kept the world singing." It was a simple line, but it carried 60 years of reflection. Cliff explained that he once felt overshadowed, even forgotten, after the Beatles' rise. But time had changed how he saw it. He realized that Paul hadn't taken anything from him. He had carried the torch forward. Without the Beatles, Cliff said, British music might have stopped with me. Instead, it became eternal. Those words ended decades of speculation. What fans thought was rivalry had really been pride mixed with insecurity, now replaced by peace. He admitted too that for years he envied Paul's creative boldness. Where Cliff had chosen stability, Paul had risked reinvention. He wrote what he felt, Cliff said. I sang what people needed. There's a difference, and both matter. It was as close as he'd ever come to confessing his quiet jealousy. Yet even that confession wasn't bitterness. It was understanding. In later interviews, Cliff spoke about how Paul reminded him of the joy in imperfection. That sometimes art came from chaos, not control. Cliff had spent decades perfecting his image. Paul had spent decades breaking his own. They represented two different kinds of courage. The truth Cliff finally told was not about rivalry, but respect. He said Paul's music taught him to see his own career differently, to stop measuring legacy by charts or cheers. Longevity, he said, isn't about how long people remember your name. It's about whether your songs still mean something to someone. That realization changed how he carried himself in his later years. The man who once feared being replaced began to see the beauty in being remembered at all. Every generation needed its own voice. He'd had his time, and Paul had his. Together they had built the bridge that others still walked across. When asked if he sect ever told Paul that directly, Cliff smiled. "I think he knows," he said. "We sect both outlived the noise. What sept's left is friendship." And in that quiet acceptance, Cliff finally let go of a shadow that had followed him for 6 decades. His truth wasn't a confession of rivalry, it was an admission of admiration and of peace. Looking back, it's hard to believe that two men who once defined an era ever felt divided at all. Cliff Richard and Paul McCartney became living symbols of what British music once promised: youth, hope, and melody that outlasted its moment. What began as quiet competition had ended in mutual grace. Cliff no longer measures his worth by the screams of crowds or the space he occupies on a chart. At 84, he sees his journey as a bridge between what was and what came next. Paul carried that bridge further, proving that pop could evolve without losing its heart. They were never rivals in spirit, only travelers on the same road, one building it, the other paving it with song. When Cliff finally spoke his truth, it wasn't about jealousy, it was about gratitude. He could finally say without hesitation that Paul's success didn't erase his own, it validated it. Everything he built had made room for what came after. And perhaps that's what time gives to those who endure, not more applause but perspective. Cliff's honesty reminded fans that every legend leaves a legacy, but only a few learn to love the ones who carry it forward. For more emotional stories, check out this video.